Alright, to get started with our Dialog Box demo, we first need to download the survival shooter from the Unity Asset Store. With the demo, we will have something quick and easy to follow along with. After downloading, create a new folder and name it 0-game, then copy the entire project into the game folder. We're doing this to separate our demo project from our scripts, so we now have the ability to use this package in other projects without having to go through and piece things together, or trying to take things apart from this project just to fit it into another project. I'm going to create a second folder and call it Demo. This is also for organizational purposes, and if we ever want to use this, they will be ready to go. Now let's open up the project by going to Game, Completed Game, and let's get started. Normally, we will create a canvas from scratch by right-clicking anywhere in the hierarchy, going to UI, then Canvas. However, there's already an HUD canvas that's available for us, so we're just going to go ahead and use that. Start by right-clicking the HUD canvas, select Create Empty, and name this Dialog Box. This will be our container for anything related to the dialog box. Now, click the dialog box object. Pressing the F key while having the cursor over the scene will center the camera over the dialog box object. Now, I want to have a good view of the scene, so I'm repositioning a bit. Now that we have that, I'm going to right-click the dialog box, head to UI, Panel, and this will be our background panel. Now click the anchor presets inside Rect Transform and set it to center. This will change our anchor points for the panel. Now, let's make this a little bit larger. Let's try 300 by 300. And don't worry too much about how it looks inside the game screen. We can always come back and adjust it as needed. If we go back, it looks a bit too much like a square, so I'm actually going to adjust this again. Change this to about 200 and change this to about 350. There we go. That looks a little bit better. Now, next thing I want to do is right click the dialog box again, go to UI, and go to button. This is going to be my first button, and then lower it down, get off to the right, make this a little bit smaller, change it and change the width inside Rect Transform to about 80, and do a little bit more to the right. Then on top, call this Next button. Open up Next button, go to text, and type Next out of here. Awesome. Now I'm going on top of Next button, doing Control D. This will duplicate it, and shifting this a little bit towards the left. Now I'm going to rename Next button on the copy to Previous button. Expand the text and type Previous. Awesome. Right click the dialog box, go to UI, off to text, and let's name this Content. Let's reposition this a bit and increase the width to about 250. Increase the height to about 100. We can see kind of like a white outline around, and we can see it's a little bit too small. So let's actually make the width a little bit bigger. Let's make it about 325. Make the height about 150. Center it, match the back panel. And now we have a nice little content section. Now let's right click dialog box, hit UI, go to text, and let's rename this page counter. Now let's reposition this to the bottom left of the panel. Make this a little bit smaller. Change the width to about 80 and reposition. And change the text to something like 0/0. Now we have like a nice page counter spot. But you know what? I actually want this centered. So let me head over to paragraph here. Center this. And let's actually reposition this a little more. And make the dimensions a little bit smaller. There we go. Now, Another thing that I don't really like here is that the content is kind of tied straight to the top. So I do want to make this just make that about 140. And there, that actually kind of gives us this nice little area to play with. Now we just need to save a copy of our dialog box as a prefab. Right click demo, hit create folder, and type prefabs. Copy over the dialog box down in prefabs. We'll create a nice prefab of our dialog. Right click demo, go to create, go to folder, and type scripts. Right click scripts, go to create, go to folder, type dialog box. Now we're going to create two C# scripts. So let's go back to create, go C# script, put dialog box, and we're going to create one more. Go back to create C# script and type content. Now, double click dialog box and this will open up Visual Studios or any scripting editor program you may have. The whole point of the dialog box in the content class is to populate the dialog box with content. The reason why the dialog box and the content are separated is so that different objects could then feed content to the dialog box to send a message to the player or to start some sort of conversation. So the first thing we're going to do is actually delete all this and have a reference towards our content class. I'm going to call this public content dialog content, and this will be our content reference. Now, the next thing that I need is public text, and since we actually don't have the reference here, I'm actually going to add the using reference up here, Unity engine.ui. Call this display text. This will be the active display. This will be the active text that is being displayed towards a player. I'm going to add one more called public text page counter. Let's switch over to our content class. Now in our content class, I actually want to delete the mono behavior reference because I don't actually want to attach this to an object. Although we do have that key. We could go that route if need be. Instead, what I want to do is I want to make this serializable. Need the using system reference, and I want to treat this a little bit differently. So instead, we will have objects that are responsible for having classes that contain the content reference, and we will use that to feed the dialog box. The first thing we'll do is do public list string content, and let's add a text area above it, references 3 and 10. Now let's read this real quick. 3 is a number of minimum lines and 10 is a number of maximum lines. This is simply how it will be displayed inside the inspector. So switch over to Unity real quick. Now if we go over to our dialog box, we could then add our dialog box class onto here. Open up dialog content, add the size, head over to 3. Now we have some nice dialog content to add to it. Now, this will just be a second. I'm just going to add some quick content in here. Now that we finished, let's fill in a few of our references. We have display text, so let's add content to display text and page counter to page counter. Now, let's go back to our class. Now that we're back at our class, we need to add a few more references. One of the things we want to do is in the dialog box, whenever the next button is pressed, we want to be able to switch on to our next content piece. So what we can do is add a brand new method called public void next button. And let's add one more called public void previous button. The way how this will work, again, switching back to Unity, is by going over to our next button. And on click, we will add a new reference to Dialog Box, head over to Dialog Box, and we have our next button here. On previous, add a new reference, Dialog Box. We have Dialog Box, previous button. Now we have two brand new references to a Dialog Box. Now let's switch back to code, and we want to do a couple updates inside of here. The first thing is update the display text and update the page counter. Now in order to also keep the page counter, we need to make sure that we keep a count of what's inside of our content. So easiest way that I can think of doing this is by adding a public int index equals 0 reference. The second thing I'll need for the page counter is also the total amount. So I'll do public int total amount get return content.count. And what this will give me is the max number of pages that I'll need. Now let's switch back to our dialog box. Inside of our dialog box, we need to do a few things. So the easiest one to do is update the display text. So we can do that by doing display text dot text equals dialog content dot, and then here we'll need our next content reference. Let's do next content piece, do control period, and this will create the new method that we'll need. And the next thing that we'll need is to also update the page counter. Let's do page counter equals string dot format zero reference 1 dialog content dot index and dialog content dot total amount. Now this will be a more visual display of how the dialog content will actually be displayed. Now we seem to have a quick error, and that's because we're trying to assign the text and not the actual string variable directly. There we go, that'll fix it. Now if we go back into content, next content piece, pushing F12, this takes us back to an internal string throw not implemented. So I'm actually going to erase this and switch this to a public variable, although it's not 100% necessary. And what we need to do here is we have to return the next available content piece. So what I'm going to do is do a public current content, and we need to actually get the current content that's being displayed from the content list. Get the current content that's being displayed in the content list by doing content dot element content dot element at. If I do control period, this will add the system dot link cube reference, and I need to feed it the index. Now there's also a bit of a problem here. When I hit next content piece, what I actually want to do is I want to return the next one from the list. If it's always at 0, I will never actually get the next one from the list. So instead, what I'll do here is I'll do index plus plus, and this will guarantee that I will get the next one by incrementing the current content value. Now all I need to do is just do return current content, and now we have the next content piece. If we go back to dialog box, we should now have something functional we can show inside of Unity. I play. Alright, after investigating a bit, the issue was that the HUD canvas did not have the interactable and block raycast enabled. These two are needed at the canvas level to allow the click events in the button to trigger. Now, let's try running the game again and see what happens. Our next button works great. However, we notice a few problems. On first load, it doesn't show our Welcome to Unity text that's found inside of our dialog box. Our page counter isn't updated until after we press next. When we reach the last page, it shows 2 out of 3 instead of 3 out of 3. And finally, the game is still continuing in the background. Let's start by tackling our first problem. We resolve it by doing a public void initialize method, make a parameter type of content, and assign the dialog content to the content piece. Next thing we want to do is to display text dot text equals dialog content dot initial content. This method doesn't exist yet, so what we can do is do control dot and do generate method. What this will be used for is to get our first initial content piece. Head off to this, make this public, set the index to 0, and do current content equals content dot element at index, and then finally return current content. Our next problem is our page counter. We can solve that by simply copy and pasting the text from inside our next button and placing it inside our initialize. Now, since it's the exact same text, what we could actually do is create a brand new method. Call this update text. And stick this inside of here and just call that method. Now this will take care of our page counter problem. We still have one more problem with our page counter that we found earlier, and that was that on the final page it said 2 out of 3 instead of 3 out of 3. We can fix that by simply adding +1 to the visible view. Now the whole reason for that is the fact that inside this element list it starts counting from 0 instead of 1. Now to the computer this looks right, but to a person it's gonna end up looking a little off because the total amount shows 3 and the maximum amount shows 2. We just need to invoke our initialize statement before we do a quick test. We can do this easily by doing public void start, doing initialize, and feeding the existing dialog content to the content piece. After doing this, we can go back to the game, hit play, it'll take a second to compile, and now we see the first one, the second one, and the third one. There's still an issue where the game is still playing in the background while we are using our dialog content, but we'll deal with that later. As for now, if we go to our console log, we notice we're getting this strange argument out of range exception. The whole reason why we're getting this exception is for the reason that when we hit play and we finally reach the max number of pages, 3 out of 3, we're still able to hit our next button asking for more content when there isn't any more content available. With all that being said, we need to disable our dialog box once we reach the max number of pages. We can do that by going back into Visual Studio, going into our update text method, and typing if dialog content dot index +1 equals dialog content dot total amount. This way we know if we reach the max number of pages, we want it to occur a certain action. We will add a boolean called is at max pages equals true. We'll start by adding it up here, public boolean is at max pages. Go back down here and assign that boolean, and add an else statement that does the exact opposite. The reason for this is since we have a next button and a previous button that we will be adding, we need to be able to disable this when coming back on previous pages. The next thing I would also like to do is I want to add a reference to the next button, and I want to update its text from next to OK when we have reached the final page. We can do that by adding a reference up here. And if we go back down here, we can add that reference next button dot get component in children text dot text equals OK. Now if we copy and paste this back into our else statement, we can then revert it back to its original text, which is next. Now if we go back into Unity, we can now run clear this, do a quick playthrough. Now we can see welcome to Unity, click next, and we have a thank you reference. Notice this hasn't updated, and the whole reason for that is that we still haven't added our next button here. So let me add the quick next button reference, and it should work on this next upcoming one. There's also one more thing that we forgot to do. We forgot to add this reference inside of our next button up top. So let me do that first. If is at max pages equals true, we just need to disable the dialog box. We can do that by typing this .gameObject.setActive is false and typing the return method. Now we just need to copy this display text and put it right before our update text method. Now the whole reason for this return method is that even though we reach a max number of pages, the code can still trigger and try to find the next content piece before it. This will make sure that it ends right there. Now if we do a quick little playtest and clear this up, we can go through 2, 3, hit OK, and we no longer get that error. Now that we have the fundamentals of our next button written out and understood, I'm going to quickly write out the same code for our previous button, except I'm going to decrement instead of increment the code instead. Now I've gone ahead and I've written the next button and the previous button content. Now if you can see, as you can see, I've re-included the update text inside the update text. Once we go back through, it will disable the is at max pages amount and revert the content of next button back to what it was previously written. Now let's do a quick play test. Clear this up, go through. And we see our content in our dialog box works just great. Now the last piece is the fact that the game is still playing in the background while we're still using the dialog box. We can solve this by going back into our code, go back into our initialize method, and add time.timescale equals 0. And this will pause the gameplay while we're going through our content button. And finally, if we go into our next button, just add time.timescale equals 1, and this will continue the game again. Now keep in mind, this isn't a permanent solution, as this is adding further functionality inside of our dialog box. A better method is to have a pause manager and having references to this code in order to have a multiple pause functionality, as you can have an options menu and a dialog box button, and you want them not to conflict against each other and disable one another. Now if we do a last test, we can see the game is paused in the background. It's not actually turning or shooting anymore. Go through next, go through previous, go through next. Okay, and there we go. We have a functioning game where the character is now working, and we had a good dialog box to add.